Good evening all, and welcome back to Hidden Fears. Tonight we venture into one of the most mysterious and haunting regions in America, the ancient peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. In this episode, we will journey through 10 deeply disturbing accounts from those who dared to walk these shadowed ridges and live to share what they witnessed. From voices that call out using the names of the living, to figures that should not exist wandering forgotten trails, to secrets buried in abandoned mining towns. These are stories that have emerged from the heart of Appalachia itself. Every account you are about to hear has been gathered from individuals who experienced these events firsthand, people who found themselves face to face with things that defy rational explanation. Each narrative has been carefully reconstructed from their testimonies, preserving the essence of their encounters while respecting their anonymity. Some names and minor details have been changed to protect those involved, but the core of each experience remains untouched and authentic. These mountains have held their secrets for centuries, and tonight we pull back the veil on just a few of them. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Hidden Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. My name is Joe, and I am from Asheville, North Carolina. About 3 years ago, I decided to take a solo hiking trip up to Grandfather Mountain. I had been going through a rough patch in my life. My girlfriend of 4 years had just ended things with me, and I needed time to clear my head and reconnect with nature. I've always found solace in the mountains, and Grandfather Mountain had been a favorite spot of mine since I was a teenager. I knew the trails there better than I knew the streets of my own neighborhood, the rugged peaks, the sweeping views, and the quiet solitude of the wilderness had always been a kind of therapy for me. So I packed my gear, told my parents where I would be, and headed out for what I thought would be a peaceful 3-day trek through familiar territory. The first day and a half went exactly as I had hoped. The weather was perfect for late September, cool enough to hike comfortably, but warm enough that I did not need heavy layers. I set up camp at one of my usual spots, a small clearing near an overlook that gave me a stunning view of the valley below. I cooked a simple dinner over my camp stove, watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, and felt, for the first time in weeks, a sense of peace settling over me. That night, I slept better than I had in months, lulled by the sound of wind rustling through the pine trees and the distant hooting of an owl. The second day, I spent most of my time hiking along the ridgeline, stopping occasionally to take photographs and enjoy the scenery. I passed a few other hikers, exchanged pleasantries about the weather and trail conditions, and felt grateful to be in such a beautiful place. As the afternoon wore on, I made my way back toward my campsite, planning to arrive with enough daylight to gather firewood and prepare dinner before the sun went down. It was perhaps around 5 in the evening when I reached the clearing, where I'd set up my tent the night before. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. My tent was still securely staked, my gear was organized, and my campfire ring sat cold and ready for another evening fire. I was bending down to unpack my backpack when I heard it. A voice calling my name from somewhere in the woods. Not just any voice, but Sarah's voice, my ex-girlfriend. I froze, my hand still on the zipper of my pack, and listened. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, calling out from somewhere beyond the tree line to my left. Joe. Joe, please. I need help. My heart started pounding. I knew logically that this could not be Sarah. She lived in Charlotte, over 2 hours away, and she had no idea I was even out here. We had not spoken since the breakup, and there was absolutely no way she could have known where I was or how to find me. But the voice sounded so much like hers, so desperate and pleading, that I found myself standing up and walking toward the sound before I could even think about what I was doing. Joe, please, I'm hurt. I need you. The voice came again, and this time it sounded closer, more urgent. I pushed through the underbrush, following the sound deeper into the forest. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stop, to turn around and go back to camp, but I could not shake the terrible feeling that something was genuinely wrong. What if Sarah really was out here? What if she had come looking for me and gotten hurt? What if I ignored her and something terrible happened? I kept walking, calling out her name, asking where she was and what had happened. The voice always seemed to be just ahead of me, just out of sight, leading me further and further from my campsite. After what felt like 20 minutes of walking, I found myself standing at the mouth of an old mine shaft. I'd hiked this trail dozens of times and had never seen this before. The entrance was partially concealed by overgrown vegetation, and a rusted metal grate hung at an angle across the opening, as if it had been pried loose years ago and never repaired. The voice was coming from inside the mine. "Joe, I'm down here. Please help me." I stood there, staring into the darkness, and felt a cold knot of fear form in my stomach. Something about this was very, very wrong. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, and that is when I noticed I had no signal. Not unusual in the mountains, but it made me feel suddenly very alone. I shone the light into the mine shaft and called out Sarah's name again. The voice that answered was not Sarah's. It was similar, close enough that my brain had been tricked, but now that I was paying attention, I could hear the difference. The pitch was slightly off, the cadence was wrong, and there was something underneath it, something cold and inhuman that made my skin crawl. "Joe. Come down here, Joe. Come find me." The voice twisted and changed as it spoke, becoming deeper, more guttural, until it sounded nothing like Sarah at all. It sounded like something pretending to be human and failing. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking as my hands trembled. Whatever was down in that mine shaft, it was not my ex-girlfriend, and it was not anything I wanted to meet. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear the voice still calling, but now it was not just Sarah's voice. It was my mother's voice, my father's voice, my best friend's voice, all layered on top of each other, all calling my name in a grotesque chorus. "Joe, come back. Joe, where are you going? Joe, we need you." I did not stop running. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest, and my lungs burned, but I did not stop. I had to get back to my campsite. I had to get out of these woods. Except I could not find my campsite. I should have been able to retrace my steps easily. I knew these trails. I knew this mountain. But everything looked wrong. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper, and no matter which direction I turned, I could not find the clearing where I'd left my tent. Panic began to set in. My phone was useless, the battery draining rapidly as I fumbled with the flashlight and tried to pull up my GPS, which refused to load. The sun was setting, and the forest was growing darker by the minute. I forced myself to stop running and take a deep breath. I pulled out my compass, the old-fashioned kind my grandfather had given me years ago, and tried to orient myself. According to the compass, my campsite should be directly to the east. I started walking slowly this time, keeping my eyes on the compass and trying to ignore the voices that still echoed through the trees around me. It felt like I walked for hours, though it was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, I stumbled out onto the main trail. Relief flooded through me. I recognized this section. If I followed it south, I would reach the trailhead and my car. I did not care about my tent or my gear. I just wanted to get off this mountain. I started jogging, my legs aching and my lungs screaming, but I did not slow down until I saw the parking lot ahead of me. My car was exactly where I had left it, and I have never been so happy to see that beat-up old Subaru in my entire life. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropped them twice, and finally managed to unlock the door and throw myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and did not look back as I peeled out of the parking lot and onto the highway. I drove straight home, stopping only once for gas, and spent the next several days trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. that the voice had been a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion, that the mine shaft had always been there, and I had simply never noticed it before, that I had gotten turned around because I was panicking and not thinking clearly. But I could not shake the feeling that something had been out there in those woods, something that knew my name and knew exactly how to lure me away from safety. A few weeks later, out of morbid curiosity, I started researching Grandfather Mountain and the surrounding area. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 20 years, at least 7 solo hikers had gone missing in that region. None of them had ever been found. In several cases, other hikers reported hearing voices calling out for help in the days leading up to the disappearances. Voices that sounded like loved ones. Voices that led them off the trail and into the wilderness. I have not been back to Grandfather Mountain since that day. I still hike, but never alone, and never in that area. And if I am ever out in the woods and I hear someone calling my name, I do not answer. I do not follow the sound. I turn around and walk the other way, because I know now that not everything that calls your name in the darkness is something you want to find. Some things in these mountains are older than we can understand, and they know exactly how to use our love and our fear against us. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I consider myself lucky that I lived to tell the tale. To this day, I cannot shake the memory of that voice, the way it twisted and changed, the way it knew exactly what to say to draw me deeper into the woods. And I know with absolute certainty that if I had gone down into that mine shaft, I would never have come back out. My name is Andrea, and I am from Richmond, Virginia. What I am about to share with you happened about 2 years ago, and even now I still have nightmares about it. My husband and I had been married for about 5 years, and we were both working demanding jobs that left us exhausted and disconnected. We decided we needed a getaway, somewhere remote and romantic, where we could unplug from the world and reconnect with each other. I spent weeks browsing through rental listings, looking for the perfect place, and eventually I found what seemed like a dream cabin tucked away in the mountains of West Virginia. The photos showed a charming wooden structure surrounded by dense forest, with a wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, and huge windows that looked out over the wilderness. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive, with guests praising the peace and quiet and the attentive host. It seemed perfect. We booked it for a long weekend in October, hoping to catch the fall foliage at its peak. The drive from Richmond took us about 4.5 hours, and the last 30 minutes were on increasingly narrow and winding roads that eventually turned to gravel and then to dirt. I remember my husband joking that we were going so far off the grid that we might never find our way back to civilization. At the time, it seemed funny. The cabin itself was even more beautiful in person than it had been in the photos. It sat in a clearing at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by towering oak and maple trees that were ablaze with autumn colors. The host, a man in his 50s named Rick, was waiting for us when we arrived. He seemed friendly enough, showing us around the property, pointing out where the firewood was stored, explaining how to work the somewhat temperamental hot water heater. But there was something about him that made me uncomfortable. He kept looking at me in a way that felt too intense, too lingering, and when he handed us the keys, he said something that struck me as odd. "Make sure you lock all the doors and windows at night. We get some strange folks wandering around these parts sometimes." I asked him what he meant by that, but he just shrugged and said it was better to be safe than sorry. My husband thanked him, and Rick left, his truck disappearing down the long driveway and leaving us alone in the middle of the forest. We spent the rest of that first day exploring the cabin, unpacking our things, and enjoying the solitude. We made dinner together in the small but well-equipped kitchen, opened a bottle of wine, and sat by the fire talking and laughing in a way we had not done in months. It felt like exactly what we needed. As the sun set and darkness closed in around the cabin, I remembered Rick's warning about locking the doors. I went around and checked every window and door, making sure everything was secure. My husband teased me for being paranoid, but I felt better knowing we were locked in tight. We went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the wine, and I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps on the porch. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. They were the footsteps of a person. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding, listening as the footsteps moved slowly across the porch, paused at the front door, and then continued around the side of the cabin. I reached over and shook my husband awake, whispering that someone was outside. He groaned and told me it was probably just an animal, but I made him get up and look. He stumbled to the window and peered out into the darkness. I watched as his expression changed from sleepy annoyance to something closer to alarm. He told me there was someone out there, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the porch light, completely motionless, facing our cabin. We both stood there, frozen, staring out the window at this figure. It did not move. It did not make a sound. It just stood there, watching. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. My husband checked all the doors and windows again, making sure everything was locked, and we spent the rest of the night huddled together in bed, too scared to sleep. When morning finally came, I went outside to look for footprints or any sign of who had been there, but I could not find anything. The ground was too dry and covered with fallen leaves. My husband suggested that maybe we had both been half asleep and imagined it, but I knew what I had seen. Someone had been watching our cabin in the middle of the night. We spent the next day trying to enjoy ourselves, hiking through the woods and taking in the beautiful scenery, but I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see someone standing in the trees, but there was never anyone there. We returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, and that is when we noticed something wrong with our car. There were scratches along the driver's side door, deep gouges in the paint that definitely had not been there that morning. My husband examined them closely and said they looked deliberate, like someone had taken a key or a knife and dragged it along the metal. We were both rattled now, and I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but my husband convinced me to stay one more night. He said we had paid for the weekend and we should not let some local vandal ruin our trip. I reluctantly agreed, but I insisted we call the host and report what had happened. Rick answered on the third ring, and I told him about the figure we had seen and the damage to our car. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then he said he would drive out first thing in the morning to take a look. He did not sound surprised or concerned, which I found odd. That night, we were both on edge. We ate a quick dinner, neither of us with much appetite, and sat by the fire trying to watch a movie on my laptop. Around 9 o'clock, I decided to step outside to get some fresh air. I walked around to the side of the cabin, and that is when I saw it. A trail camera, the kind hunters use, mounted on a tree about 15 feet from our bedroom window. It was angled directly at the window, perfectly positioned to capture anyone inside. My blood ran cold. I called for my husband, and when he saw the camera, his face went pale. He climbed up and pulled it down, and we brought it inside to examine it. The camera had a memory card inside. My husband pulled it out and inserted it into his laptop. What we found made me feel physically sick. The card contained hundreds of photos, maybe thousands. Photos of the cabin from every angle. Photos of previous guests through the windows, cooking, sleeping, changing clothes, intimate moments that should have been private. There were photos of us from the past 2 days, eating dinner, sitting by the fire, lying in bed. Someone had been watching every move we made since we arrived. We looked at each other, and without saying a word, we both knew we had to get out of there immediately. We started throwing our things into our bags, moving as quickly as we could. I was shaking so badly I could barely zip my suitcase. My husband grabbed the car keys and headed outside while I did a final sweep of the cabin to make sure we had not left anything behind. That is when I heard my husband shout. I ran outside to find him standing by the car, the hood open. Someone had disabled the engine. Wires were cut, hoses were disconnected, and it was clear that we were not going anywhere in that vehicle. Panic set in. We had no cell service. We were miles from the nearest town, and whoever had been watching us had made sure we could not leave. My husband told me to get back inside and barricade the door. We dragged the heavy wooden table in front of the front door and pushed the couch against the back door. I tried my phone again, desperately hoping for even one bar of signal, but there was nothing. And then we heard the voices, multiple voices coming from outside, discussing us like we were not even human. Male voices, low and casual, talking about whether they should wait us out or go ahead and break in now. I recognized one of the voices as Rick, the host. He was talking about how we had found the camera and how that complicated things. My husband found a landline phone in the kitchen, an old-fashioned thing mounted on the wall, and to our immense relief, it had a dial tone. He called 911, and I have never been so grateful to hear a dispatcher's voice in my entire life. My husband explained where we were and what was happening, and the dispatcher told us to stay inside and keep the doors locked. She said police were on their way, but that it would take at least 20 minutes for them to reach our location. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. We could hear the men outside, circling the cabin, testing the doors and windows. Someone tried to pry open a window in the bedroom, and my husband grabbed a fire poker from the fireplace, ready to fight if they got inside. I huddled in the corner, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline, even though it was useless. The men outside seemed to be arguing about what to do. One voice wanted to leave before the police arrived. Another voice, Rick's voice, was insisting they could not leave witnesses. That is when I truly understood the danger we were in. These men were not just voyeurs or thieves. They had done this before, and they had plans for us that went far beyond just watching. The minutes crawled by in agonizing slowness, and then finally, we heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Police sirens in the distance getting closer. The voices outside went silent. We heard the sound of people running, crashing through the underbrush, and then car engines starting somewhere in the woods. By the time the police arrived, the men were gone, but they had left behind plenty of evidence. The police found 2 more trail cameras hidden around the property, along with a shed behind the cabin that contained equipment for drugging guests, zip ties, and other things I do not want to describe. They arrested Rick and 2 other men within 48 hours. It turned out they had been running this operation for over 3 years, targeting couples who rented the cabin. They would watch the guests, and if they seemed vulnerable or isolated enough, they would disable their vehicles and either rob them or worse. We were lucky. We found the camera before things escalated too far, and we were able to call for help. The police told us that at least 4 other couples had reported strange incidents at that cabin over the years, but no one had ever found the cameras or connected the dots until now. Rick and his accomplices were charged with multiple crimes, including voyeurism, stalking, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and attempted assault. My husband and I had to testify at their trial, which was one of the hardest things I have ever done. All 3 men were convicted and are currently serving lengthy prison sentences. We have not taken a vacation since then. The thought of staying in a remote rental property makes me feel physically ill. I have anxiety attacks sometimes, triggered by the smallest things like seeing a trail camera in a sporting goods store or hearing footsteps on a wooden floor. My husband and I both went through therapy to deal with the trauma, and our relationship has actually grown stronger because of what we went through together. But I will never forget the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, of knowing that there were people out there who saw us not as human beings, but as prey. If there is any lesson to take from this, it is to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if you ever rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere, check for cameras, keep your doors locked, and make sure your phone is charged, because you never know who might be watching. My name is Liam, and I am from Columbus, Ohio. I've always been fascinated by photography, particularly landscape and nature photography. About 1.5 years ago, I became obsessed with capturing a phenomenon that I had read about online, the Brown Mountain Lights. For those who do not know, the Brown Mountain Lights are mysterious glowing orbs that appear over Brown Mountain in North Carolina, in the Blue Ridge Mountain section of the Appalachian Range. People have been reporting these lights for over a century, and despite numerous scientific investigations, no one has been able to definitively explain what causes them. Some say they are ghost lights, spirits of Cherokee maidens searching for their lost lovers. Others claim they are UFOs, or some kind of unknown atmospheric phenomenon. Whatever they are, I was determined to photograph them. I planned my trip carefully, researching the best viewing locations, the optimal weather conditions, and the times of year when the lights were most frequently reported. I gathered all my photography equipment, packed my camping gear, and drove down from Ohio to North Carolina in early November. The drive took me about 9 hours, and I arrived at the Blue Ridge Parkway just as the sun was beginning to set. I had obtained all the proper permits for backcountry camping, and I hiked about 3 miles off the main trail to reach a ridge that several online forums had identified as one of the best spots for viewing the lights. I set up my tent, organized my camera equipment, and settled in to wait for darkness. The night was clear and cold, perfect conditions according to everything I had read. I set up my tripod and camera, pointing it toward Brown Mountain in the distance, and waited. For the first few hours, nothing happened. I saw stars. I saw the occasional airplane passing overhead. I saw the distant lights of small towns in the valley below, but no mysterious glowing orbs. I was starting to think I had wasted my time and money on this trip when around midnight, I saw them. At first, it was just one light, a soft yellowish glow that appeared over the ridgeline of Brown Mountain. It hovered there for a moment, pulsing gently, and then began to move. Not in a straight line like an airplane or a drone, but in erratic patterns, zigzagging and looping through the air. I immediately started taking photographs, my hands shaking with excitement as I adjusted my exposure settings and tried to capture the phenomenon. Then another light appeared, and another. Within minutes, there were 6 of them, dancing and weaving through the darkness like living things. They were mesmerizing, beautiful, and eerie at the same time. I watched them through my camera lens, snapping photo after photo, completely absorbed in what I was witnessing. And then something changed. The lights, which had been floating over the distant mountain, began to move closer. At first, I thought it was an optical illusion, but no, they were definitely approaching my position. Within minutes, the lights had crossed the valley and were hovering just above the tree line, maybe 200 yards from where I was standing. I could see them clearly now without the camera. They were roughly spherical, about the size of a basketball, and they emitted a soft, pulsing glow that shifted between yellow and white. They made no sound, they cast no shadows, and they seemed to be aware of me. I stood there, frozen, as the lights began to circle my campsite. One of them drifted close enough that I could have reached out and touched it, though something deep in my gut told me that would be a terrible idea. I felt a strange sensation wash over me, like static electricity building in the air. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up, and I tasted metal in my mouth, sharp and bitter. My camera, which had been working perfectly moments before, suddenly shut off. The screen went black, and when I tried to turn it back on, nothing happened. My phone, which I had been using as a backup to record video, also died. The battery had been at 70%, and now it was completely drained. The lights continued to circle me, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost intelligent. I felt dizzy and disoriented, like the ground beneath my feet was tilting. I tried to call out, though I do not know what I thought I was going to say or who I thought would hear me. My voice came out as barely a whisper. And then one of the lights moved directly in front of my face, hovering there maybe 3 feet away. I stared into it, and I swear I could see something moving inside the glow, shapes and patterns that my brain could not quite process. I felt a pressure building in my head, a sensation like someone was trying to push their way into my thoughts. And then everything went white. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the ground next to my tent, and the sky was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. I sat up, confused and disoriented, and looked at my watch. It was 4:15 in the morning. The last time I had checked my watch, it had been just after midnight. I had lost nearly 4 hours. I had no memory of what had happened during that time. No memory of the lights leaving. No memory of lying down. Nothing. Just a blank space where those hours should have been. I felt strange, like I had been drugged or like I had just woken from a very deep sleep. My head ached, and my mouth was incredibly dry. I stumbled to my feet and looked around my campsite. Everything was exactly as I had left it: my tent, my backpack, my camping gear. But my camera and phone were lying on the ground several feet away from where I remembered setting them up. I picked up my camera with trembling hands and tried to turn it on. This time, it powered up normally, and the battery showed 60% charge. That was impossible. The battery had been dead hours earlier, and I had not recharged it. I navigated to my photo gallery, desperate to see the images I had captured of the lights. The gallery was empty. Every single photograph I had taken that night was gone. Not just the photos of the lights, but all the photos I had taken during the hike-in, the sunset, the setup of my camp, everything. The memory card had been completely wiped. My phone was the same. It turned on, battery showing 40%, but all my videos and photos from the trip were gone. It was as if the devices had been reset, though my other files and apps were all still there. I checked my body for any signs of injury or anything unusual. That is when I noticed the marks on my left forearm. 3 perfectly circular indentations in my skin, each about the size of a quarter, arranged in a triangular pattern. They did not hurt, and they did not look like burns or cuts. They looked almost like pressure marks, as if something had gripped my arm very tightly. But I had no memory of anything touching me. I felt a wave of fear and nausea wash over me. What had happened to me during those missing hours? What had the lights done? I made the decision right then to pack up my gear and get off that mountain as quickly as possible. I did not care about the photographs anymore. I did not care about solving the mystery of the Brown Mountain lights. I just wanted to go home. The hike back to my car took me just under 2 hours, and I drove straight through to Ohio, stopping only for gas and coffee. When I got home, I tried to put the experience behind me, tried to convince myself that I had fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing, that the missing time was just a gap in my memory caused by exhaustion. But I could not explain the marks on my arm, which took nearly 3 weeks to fully fade, and I could not explain what happened next. About 2 weeks after I returned from North Carolina, I was in my apartment in Columbus, getting ready for bed, when I looked out my bedroom window and saw them. The lights. 3 of them, hovering in the air above my apartment building, exactly like the ones I'd seen in the mountains. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, watching as they drifted back and forth outside my window. They stayed for maybe 5 minutes, and then they simply blinked out of existence as if someone had flipped a switch. This happened 3 more times over the next month. The lights would appear without warning, always at night, always outside my window, and they would hover there for a few minutes before disappearing. I started keeping my curtains closed all the time. I had trouble sleeping. I became paranoid and anxious, constantly checking over my shoulder, constantly watching the sky. I did not tell anyone what was happening because I knew how insane it would sound. I considered moving, finding a new apartment in a different part of the city, but something told me the lights would follow me no matter where I went. And then, as suddenly as they had started appearing, they stopped. The last time I saw them was in late January, about 6 weeks after my trip to North Carolina. I have not seen them since. It has been over a year now, and there have been no more sightings, no more missing time, no more strange marks on my skin. But I am not the same person I was before that trip. I sold all my photography equipment. I have no desire to chase mysteries anymore, and I have spent countless hours researching the brown mountain lights and similar phenomena. What I found has not given me any comfort. There are hundreds of accounts from people who have witnessed the lights, and many of them report similar experiences to mine. Missing time, electronic equipment failing, strange marks on their bodies, and the lights appearing in locations far from where they were first seen, as if following the witnesses home. Some researchers believe the lights are a natural phenomenon, piezoelectric effects from the quartz in the mountains, or some kind of ball lightning, but that does not explain the intelligence they seem to display, the way they interact with observers, the missing time, and the persistent sightings that follow people across state lines. I do not have any answers. I do not know what I encountered on that mountain, and I am not sure I want to know. All I can tell you is what happened to me, and I know it was real because I still have the faint scars on my arm where those marks were. Sometimes, late at night, I look out my window at the sky and wonder if they are still out there, if they are still watching me, and I wonder if, someday, they will come back. I tell myself that I will not go to the window if I see the lights again. I tell myself I will close the curtains and pretend I did not see anything. But part of me knows that if they want to find me, curtains will not stop them. Whatever those lights are, they are not bound by the rules of our world. They exist in the spaces between explanation and understanding, and I was foolish enough to go looking for them. Now I have to live with the knowledge that they found me too. My name is Wayne, and I am from Roanoke, Virginia. I've been an avid hiker for most of my adult life, and about 3 years ago, my buddy Carl and I decided to do a week-long section hike of the Appalachian Trail through Virginia. We had both done plenty of hiking before. We were in good shape. We had all the right gear, and we were looking forward to a week of beautiful scenery and good conversation. The weather forecast looked perfect. Clear skies and mild temperatures, ideal conditions for late spring hiking. We started our trek on a Monday morning, full of energy and enthusiasm, and for the first 2 days, everything went exactly as planned. We made good time on the trail, covered about 12 miles each day, and set up camp at designated sites where we met other friendly hikers doing the same thing. It was on the afternoon of our third day when we encountered him. We were hiking along a particularly scenic stretch of trail, winding through old-growth forest, with occasional breaks that offered stunning views of the valley below. We had just stopped for a water break when we saw an older man coming up the trail behind us. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older, with a weathered face and a thick white beard. What struck me immediately was his hiking gear. It looked ancient, like something out of a museum. He wore heavy canvas pants, leather boots that had to weigh 5 pounds each, and carried a wooden-framed backpack that I had only ever seen in photographs from the 1950s. His clothes looked worn, but clean, and everything about him seemed oddly out of place in the modern world. Carl and I exchanged glances as the old man approached. We greeted him with the usual trail pleasantries, asking how his hike was going and where he was headed. He smiled warmly and told us in a thick mountain accent that he was heading north, same as us. Then, without us asking, he said something that made my skin prickle. He told us there was a bad storm coming, that we should find shelter before nightfall, and that the mountain does not forgive those who ignore her warnings. Carl and I both looked up at the sky. It was a perfect blue, not a single cloud visible. I pulled out my phone to check the weather forecast, and it still showed clear conditions for the next 3 days. I mentioned this to the old man, but he just shook his head slowly and said, "Technology does not know the mountain like he does." He tipped his hat to us and continued up the trail at a pace that seemed impossible for someone his age. Within minutes, he had pulled far ahead of us, moving with an easy, steady gait that made our own efforts seem sluggish. We continued hiking, and over the next hour we kept catching glimpses of the old man ahead of us on the trail. Every time we thought we were closing the distance, he would somehow be even further ahead, always just visible around the next bend or at the top of the next rise. Carl commented that the old guy must be in, incredible shape to move that fast, especially with that heavy old-fashioned pack. We passed a couple of other hikers going the opposite direction, and out of curiosity, I asked them if they had seen the elderly man in vintage gear. They looked at me strangely and said they had not seen anyone matching that description all day. That struck me as odd because the old man had to have passed them on the trail. There was no other way he could have gotten ahead of us. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to change. Clouds started rolling in from the west, dark and heavy, moving faster than any weather front I had ever seen. Within an hour, the perfect blue sky had turned gray and ominous. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and bending the treetops. Carl and I looked at each other with growing concern. The old man had been right about the storm. We checked our map and saw that there was an emergency shelter about 2 miles ahead. We picked up our pace, wanting to reach it before the weather turned truly nasty. The first drops of rain started falling just as we arrived at the shelter, a 3-sided wooden structure with a roof and a raised sleeping platform. We hurried inside, shrugging off our packs, and grateful to have made it before the storm hit in earnest. The shelter was empty except for one person. The old man was sitting in the far corner, leaning against the back wall, his ancient pack beside him. He smiled at us as we came in, as if he had been expecting us. He said he told us to find shelter, and he was glad we had listened. The storm hit hard and fast. Rain came down in sheets, driven sideways by howling wind. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it made my chest vibrate, and lightning lit up the forest in brilliant white flashes. Carl and I sat on the platform, watching the storm through the open front of the shelter, amazed at how quickly the weather had changed. The old man sat quietly in his corner, seemingly unbothered by the violence of the storm raging outside. After a while, I tried to make conversation. I asked him his name and how long he had been hiking the trail. He told us his name was Thomas, and that he had been hiking these mountains for longer than we could imagine. I asked him about his gear, commenting on how authentic and well-preserved it looked. He glanced down at his equipment and said it had served him well for many years. Then he started telling us about the Appalachian Trail, about how it used to be before it became popular, before it was well-marked and maintained, when it was truly wild and dangerous. He spoke about hiking in the late 1940s and early 50s, about the people he had met and the things he had seen. His stories were vivid and detailed, filled with the kind of specific observations that only come from lived experience. But something about the way he spoke made me increasingly uneasy. He talked about those years as if they were recent, as if he had just hiked those trails last season, not 70 years ago. Carl asked him how old he was, and Thomas just smiled and said he had stopped counting birthdays a long time ago. The storm continued for hours. At some point, exhaustion caught up with me, and I dozed off despite the noise of the wind and rain. When I woke up, it was dark outside, and Carl was asleep beside me. The storm had lessened somewhat, though rain was still falling. I looked over to where the old man had been sitting, ready to ask him if he needed anything, but the corner was empty. I figured he must have stepped outside, though why anyone would go out in that weather was beyond me. I waited for him to return, but after 15 minutes, he still had not come back. I woke Carl and told him the old man was gone. We both got up and looked around the shelter and the immediate area outside, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. His pack was gone too. It was as if he had simply vanished. We settled back down, confused but too tired to worry about it much. We figured he must have decided to keep hiking despite the storm, though that seemed like a dangerously foolish decision. The next morning, we woke to clear skies and sunshine, as if the violent storm had never happened. We packed up our gear and continued north on the trail. About a mile from the shelter, we passed a memorial plaque mounted on a rock beside the trail. I had seen similar plaques before, small monuments to hikers who had died on the trail, but this one made my blood run cold. The plaque read, "In memory of Thomas Whitaker, who died on this trail June 12, 1957, during a sudden storm. May he rest in the mountains he loved. There was a photograph on the plaque, a black and white image of a man in hiking gear. It was the old man we had spent the evening with. The same face, the same beard, the same kind smile. The photograph even showed him wearing the same style of clothes and carrying the same wooden-framed pack. Carl and I stood there, in stunned silence, reading and rereading the plaque, looking at the photograph, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. There was no doubt in my mind that it was the same person. The date of death was exactly 66 years ago, almost to the day. Carl finally broke the silence, his voice shaking, and said we needed to report this to someone. We hiked to the next trail station and told the ranger on duty what had happened. The ranger listened to our story with a calm, knowing expression that suggested he had heard similar accounts before. He told us that Thomas Whitaker's ghost had been reported on that section of trail for decades. Dozens of hikers over the years had encountered an old man matching his description, always before major storms, always warning them to seek shelter. The ranger said Thomas had died trying to help other hikers during a freak storm in 1957, and some people believed his spirit remained on the trail, still trying to protect those who walked the path he loved. We asked the ranger if he believed the stories. He shrugged and said it did not matter what. My name is Lucas, and I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. What happened to me about 18 months ago still feels like something out of a nightmare, and I would not believe it myself if I had not lived through it. I was driving back home from a business trip in Lexington, Kentucky, and I had decided to take the scenic route through the back roads instead of sitting in traffic on the interstate. It was a beautiful autumn afternoon, and I thought it would be nice to see some of the countryside and maybe discover some interesting small towns along the way. I had a full tank of gas, my phone was charged, and I was in no particular hurry to get home. I plugged a general route into my GPS and started following the winding roads through the hills of eastern Kentucky, enjoying the fall colors and the peaceful solitude. After about 2 hours of driving, my gas gauge was getting low, and I started looking for a place to fill up. The roads I was on were remote, passing through stretches of dense forest and the occasional abandoned farm, but not much else. My GPS showed a town called Hellier about 15 miles ahead, and I figured I could get gas there. As I got closer, I started seeing hand-painted signs along the road, the kind that looked like they had been there for decades, advertising things like fresh eggs, quilts for sale, and firewood. The signs were weathered and faded, and something about them made me feel like I was driving backward through time. When I finally reached Hellier, that feeling only intensified. The town looked like it had been frozen in the 1940s. The buildings were old brick and wood structures, none of them taller than 2 stories, with faded paint and sagging roof lines. There were a few cars parked along the main street, but they were all older models, nothing newer than the early 2000s. The streets were mostly empty, just a handful of people visible here and there, standing in doorways or walking slowly along the cracked sidewalks. Every single one of them stopped what they were doing to stare at me as I drove past. It was not casual curiosity. It was intense, unfriendly scrutiny. I felt like an intruder, like I had stumbled into a place where outsiders were not welcome. I spotted a gas station at the end of the main street, a small cinder block building with 2 ancient pumps out front. I pulled in and got out of my car, immediately noticing how quiet everything was. No traffic sounds, no music from open windows, just an eerie, oppressive silence. The gas station attendant, a thin man in his 50s with suspicious eyes, came out and watched me without saying a word. I asked him if the pumps were working, and he nodded slowly and told me they only took cash. I said that was fine and started pumping gas. While the tank was filling, I noticed the price displayed on the pump was nearly double what gas should cost. I mentioned this to the attendant, and he just shrugged and said that was the price in Hellier. Take it or leave it. I did not have much choice, so I paid the inflated price with cash and asked him how to get back to the main highway. He gave me vague directions, pointing down a road that led out of town in the opposite direction from which I had come. He said the bridge I had used to get into town had washed out that afternoon, and I would have to go the long way around. That struck me as strange because I had crossed that bridge less than an hour ago, and it had been perfectly fine, but I thanked him and got back in my car. As I started to leave, I noticed more people had appeared on the street, all of them watching me with the same cold, calculating stares. I followed the road the attendant had indicated, but instead of leading me to the highway, it wound deeper into the hills, getting narrower and more poorly maintained with each passing mile. After about 20 minutes, I realized I was completely lost. My GPS had stopped working, showing only a blank screen, and my phone had no signal. I turned around and headed back toward Hellier, figuring I would try a different route or at least get better directions. When I got back to town, it was starting to get dark, and the atmosphere had grown even more oppressive. I stopped at what looked like a small general store and went inside to ask for help. The woman behind the counter, elderly and stern-faced, told me that since the bridge was out, I would have to stay in town overnight and leave in the morning when there was enough light to navigate the mountain road safely. I did not like that idea at all, but she insisted it was too dangerous to drive those roads in the dark. She directed me to a motel at the edge of town, a run-down single-story building with about 10 rooms. The owner, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and a forced smile, took my information and asked for my car keys. He said it was for security, to make sure I did not leave without paying. I hesitated, but I was exhausted and did not want to drive around lost in the dark, so I reluctantly handed them over, along with my driver's license. He gave me a key to room 7 and told me there was no restaurant in town, but there were vending machines outside the office. I went to my room, which was exactly as depressing as I had expected, with a saggy bed, stained carpet, and a bathroom that smelled of mildew. I locked the door and sat on the bed, feeling increasingly anxious about this entire situation. Around 9 o'clock that night, I heard voices outside my window. I peered through the thin curtains and saw the motel owner talking on a cell phone, pacing back and forth in the parking lot. I could not hear everything he was saying, but I caught enough to make my heart start racing. He was talking about another one, about how my car was nice and would bring a good price, and about how they would take care of it in the morning. He said something about stripping it by dawn and making sure I did not cause any trouble. I felt ice run through my veins. This entire town was a trap. They had lied about the bridge, inflated the gas prices to make sure I would pay in cash, and now they were planning to steal my car and God knows what else. I had to get out of there immediately. I waited until the motel owner went back into the office, then I quietly slipped out of my room and moved toward the office building. Through the window, I could see him sitting at the desk with his back to me. My car keys were hanging on a pegboard on the wall behind him. I knew I had one chance to do this. I went around to the back of the office and found a small window that was slightly open. I managed to push it open wider and squeeze through, landing as quietly as I could on the floor of a storage room. I crept to the doorway that led into the main office. The owner was watching a small television, completely absorbed. I took a deep breath, rushed forward, grabbed my keys off the pegboard, and ran for the front door before he even had time to react. I heard him shouting behind me as I sprinted to my car. I jumped in, jammed the key into the ignition, and thanked every higher power I could think of when the engine started immediately. The motel owner came running out of the office, along with several other men who seemed to appear out of nowhere. I threw the car into reverse, nearly hitting one of them, then shifted into drive and floored it. I headed straight for the road I had originally come in on, the one with the supposedly washed-out bridge. As I approached the edge of town, I saw that they had set up a roadblock. 2 trucks parked across the road and several men standing in front of them. They were waving at me to stop, but there was no way in hell I was stopping. I aimed for the gap between the trucks and the ditch, accelerated hard, and crashed through. My car scraped against one of the trucks and I heard my side mirror shatter, but I made it through. I drove like a maniac down that dark mountain road, my headlights bouncing wildly as I hit potholes and rough patches. Behind me, I could see headlights following, at least 2 vehicles in pursuit. I pushed my car as fast as I dared on the winding road, praying I would not miss a turn and go over the edge. And then I saw it. The bridge. It was perfectly intact, exactly as it had been when I crossed it earlier. They had lied about everything. I flew across the bridge and kept driving, not slowing down until I hit the main highway 20 minutes later. The vehicles that had been chasing me had fallen back somewhere in the darkness, either giving up or not wanting to follow me onto the highway where other people might see what was happening. I drove straight to the nearest state police barracks and told them everything that had happened. The police took my statement seriously and sent officers to investigate Hellier. What they found confirmed my worst fears. The town did exist, but it had a long and dark history. Over the years, multiple travelers had reported being overcharged, having their vehicles tampered with, or being pressured to stay overnight under suspicious circumstances. Some people who had passed through Hellier reported having their cars stolen. The police found evidence of a chop shop operation in a barn outside of town, along with records suggesting the residents had been systematically targeting and robbing outsiders for years, possibly decades. Several arrests were made, including the motel owner and the gas station attendant. I had to return to the area weeks later to testify and to identify the men who had chased me. The experience changed how I travel. I no longer take back roads through unfamiliar areas, and I never let anyone take my car keys for any reason. I learned that there are places in this country hidden away in the mountains and hollows where outsiders are seen not as visitors, but as opportunities. Places where people have developed their own twisted economies based on preying on those who are unlucky enough to stumble into their territory. Hellier is still there, still on the map, though I have heard the state police keep a much closer eye on it now, but I will never forget the feeling of being trapped in that town, of realizing that I was surrounded by people who meant me harm, and of knowing that if I had not escaped when I did, I might never have made it home at all. My name is Judy, and I am from Knoxville, Tennessee. I work as an environmental geologist, and my job involves surveying old mining sites throughout the Appalachian region to assess potential environmental hazards and contamination risks. It is technical work that requires a scientific mindset, and I have never been someone who believed in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. I deal in data, soil samples, and geological surveys, not ghost stories. But what happened to me 2 years ago has challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. I was working alone in a remote area of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina, surveying an abandoned copper mine that had been sealed since 1902. The mine had been the site of a catastrophic collapse that killed 47 miners, and the entrance had been sealed with concrete and steel shortly after the disaster. My job was to take soil and water samples from the area around the sealed entrance to determine if any heavy metals or contaminants were leaching into the surrounding environment. It was a beautiful October morning when I arrived at the site. The mine was located at the end of an old logging road, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest that had reclaimed most of the evidence that people had ever worked there. The only visible remnants were the sealed mine entrance, a massive concrete plug set into the hillside, and some scattered pieces of rusted equipment half buried in the undergrowth. I set up my equipment and began taking measurements, working methodically through my checklist. The area was perfectly quiet except for the sound of birds and the rustle of wind through the trees. I had been working for about an hour when I heard it. Music. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It sounded like old-time Appalachian folk music, the kind played on fiddles and banjos, with a rhythm that suggested people dancing and clapping along. I stopped what I was doing and listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The music seemed to be coming from underground, echoing up from somewhere deep beneath my feet. I walked over to the sealed mine entrance and pressed my ear against the cold concrete. The music was definitely coming from inside the mine, or at least from somewhere below ground. That should have been impossible. The mine had been sealed for over a century. There was no way anyone could be down there, and even if someone had somehow gotten inside, where would they have found instruments? And why would they be playing music in an abandoned mine shaft? I pulled out my phone and started recording, wanting to capture evidence of what I was hearing. The music continued, a lively, almost frantic melody that seemed to grow louder the longer I listened. I called my supervisor, thinking maybe there was some kind of geological explanation. Maybe sound was traveling through rock fissures from some distant source. He answered on the third ring, and I explained what I was hearing. I held my phone up to the concrete so he could hear it too. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then my supervisor asked me to describe exactly what I was hearing. I told him it sounded like a full band playing traditional mountain music, multiple instruments, possibly voices singing along. He told me that was impossible and that I should probably take a break, get some water. Maybe I was experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination from working alone in a remote area. But then I held the phone back up to the concrete and he went quiet. He could hear it too. He told me to stay on the line while he contacted some other colleagues to listen. Over the next 15 minutes, I played the music for 3 different people over the phone, and all of them confirmed they could hear it clearly. This was not a hallucination. This was real sound coming from a sealed mine that should have been completely silent. I decided to set up my seismic equipment, instruments designed to detect underground movement and vibrations. If there was some natural explanation for the music, the equipment might pick up something useful. What the readings showed made no sense at all. The equipment was detecting movement deep underground, rhythmic vibrations consistent with the tempo of the music. But it was also detecting heat signatures, sources of warmth at a depth of approximately 200 feet, right where the old mine tunnels would have been. That should not have been possible. The mine had been sealed for 123 years. There was no air circulation, no light, no way for anything to survive down there. And yet, the instruments were clearly showing activity. I called my supervisor back and described what the equipment was reading. He told me to pack up immediately and leave the site. He said he was contacting the State Geological Survey and possibly the authorities because whatever was happening was beyond our scope of work. But I could not leave. I know that sounds foolish, and believe me, part of me was screaming to pack up my gear and get out of there, but I am a scientist, and I needed to understand what was happening. The music continued for hours. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the music changed. It became faster, more intense, almost frantic. And then I started hearing voices. Not singing voices, though there was singing too, but voices speaking in languages I did not recognize. Some sounded like English, but with accents so thick I could not make out the words. Others were completely foreign, possibly Cherokee or other Native American languages, possibly something else entirely. The voices seemed to be layered on top of each other, dozens of different speakers all talking at once, creating a chaotic wall of sound that made my head ache. My equipment started giving readings that should not have been possible. The heat signatures underground were increasing, showing temperatures that suggested living bodies, multiple heat sources moving in patterns that looked almost like people walking or dancing. The seismic sensors were detecting what looked like footsteps, rhythmic impacts against stone surfaces deep underground. I watched my instruments with growing disbelief, checking and rechecking the calibrations, convinced that something must be malfunctioning. But everything was working perfectly. The data was real. As the sun touched the horizon and long shadows stretched across the clearing, the music reached a crescendo. It was so loud now that I did not need to press my ear against the concrete to hear it. It echoed through the forest, a wild, joyous sound that felt completely wrong in this abandoned place. And then I felt it. A vibration under my feet, a deep rhythmic pounding that seemed to make the ground itself pulse in time with the music. I stepped back from the sealed entrance, suddenly terrified. The concrete looked like it was moving, bulging outward slightly with each beat of the music, as if something on the other side was pressing against it. That was when I made the decision to leave. I did not care about scientific curiosity anymore. I did not care about data or explanations. Something was happening here that I could not rationalize, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from this place. I grabbed my most essential equipment, leaving behind the heavier instruments and sample cases, and ran for my truck. Behind me, the music continued, and I could swear I heard laughter mixed in with the sounds of instruments and voices. I drove down that rutted logging road faster than was safe, my truck bouncing and sliding on the loose gravel, not slowing down until I reached the paved highway 20 minutes later. I called my supervisor from the road and told him I had left the site and that I was not going back. He told me that was the right decision and that they would send a team to retrieve my equipment. 2 days later, a team of 4 geologists returned to the site, along with a state police officer. They found all my equipment exactly where I had left it. The recordings I had made were still on my phone, clear evidence of the music, though the team that returned reported hearing nothing. The site was completely silent when they were there. They checked my seismic equipment and confirmed that the readings I had documented were accurate and had been properly recorded. Heat signatures deep underground, movement patterns, all of it was there in the data, but they had no explanation for any of it. The sealed mine entrance showed no signs of damage or tampering. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside, and no natural geological process could account for the sounds and readings I had documented. In the weeks that followed, I did extensive research into the history of that mine. I learned that the 47 miners who died in the 1902 collapse had been a diverse group. Some were local men, some were immigrants from Europe, and some were Cherokee workers from the surrounding area. On the day of the collapse, the miners had been trapped underground for nearly 18 hours before the final cave-in killed them all. According to newspaper accounts from the time, rescuers on the surface reported hearing sounds from below ground during those 18 hours, including voices, singing, and even music. Some of the trapped miners apparently had instruments with them, harmonicas and a fiddle, and they played music to keep their spirits up while they waited for rescue that never came. The accounts described how the music could be heard echoing up from the ground and how it continued right up until the final collapse that sealed the miners in their tomb forever. I also discovered that I was not the first person to report hearing music at that site. Over the past century, there have been dozens of documented reports from hikers, surveyors, and others who passed near the sealed mine. Many described hearing fiddle music, singing, and voices speaking in multiple languages coming from underground. Some reports date back to just a few years after the mine was sealed. There is no official explanation for the phenomenon. Geologists have suggested that it might be related to underground water movement or wind passing through rock fissures. But those explanations do not account for the specific nature of the sounds, the musical patterns, the voices, or the heat signatures and movement that my equipment detected. I have my recording, I have my data, and I have no answers. All I know is that something happens at that site, something that defies rational explanation. Whether it is some kind of residual energy from the tragedy that occurred there, or something else entirely, I cannot say. What I can say is that I will never work alone at a remote site again, and I will never dismiss the stories that people tell about the strange things they encounter in these mountains. The Appalachians are old, far older than human civilization, and there are things happening in these hills that science has not yet learned to explain. My name is Carl, and I am from Chattanooga, Tennessee. My best friend Ethan and I have been doing an annual camping trip together since we were in college, over 15 years now. We always go to the Great Smoky Mountains in early June, same location, same trails, same traditions. It is our way of staying connected despite our busy lives and family obligations. 3 years ago, we set out on what should have been just another normal trip. We planned to spend 5 days deep in the backcountry, far from the crowded tourist areas, hiking during the day and camping at established sites at night. The first 2 days were perfect. The weather was beautiful, the trails were in good condition, and Ethan and I fell back into our usual rhythm of hiking, talking about everything and nothing, and enjoying the peace of the wilderness. On the third night, we set up camp at a site we had used before, a small clearing beside a stream about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead. After we finished setting up our tents and cooking dinner, Ethan said he was going to walk down to the stream to filter some water for the next day. The stream was only about 50 yards from our campsite, well within sight, and it was still light enough to see clearly. I stayed at camp, organizing our gear and getting the fire ready for the evening. I watched Ethan walk down to the stream, kneel beside the water, and start filling his water bottles. Then I turned my attention back to what I was doing, not thinking anything was unusual. Ethan was gone for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, which was longer than it should have taken to fill a couple of water bottles, but not so long that I was worried. When he came walking back up to camp, I glanced up and smiled, ready to make some joke about him taking his time. But the smile died on my face before I could speak. Something was wrong. I could not put my finger on it at first. It looked like Ethan. Same height, same build, same face, same clothes. But something about the way he moved was off. His gait was slightly wrong. His joints seemed to bend at angles that were not quite natural, and his expression was blank in a way that Ethan's face never was. I asked him if he was okay, and he smiled at me. It was Ethan's smile, but it did not reach his eyes. He said he was fine, just fine, in a voice that sounded like Ethan's voice, but with a flatness to it, like someone doing an imitation. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was getting to me. But as the evening went on, the feeling only grew stronger. This thing that looked like Ethan sat across the fire from me, and I watched it carefully, cataloging all the small ways it was wrong. It did not blink. I timed it. Over the course of 5 minutes, it did not blink even once. It sat completely still except for its head, which would turn occasionally to look at different things around camp, but its body remained rigid, unmoving. When I asked it about our conversation from earlier that day, about the trail we had hiked and the wildlife we had seen, it gave vague, non-committal answers that did not match what we had actually talked about. I mentioned an inside joke we had shared for years, something that always made Ethan laugh, and the thing just stared at me with that blank expression. I tried another test. I brought up Ethan's wife and kids, asked how they were doing. Ethan talked about his family constantly, carried photos of his kids, always had some new story to share. The thing across from me said they were fine, nothing more. No details, no emotion, no recognition of the names when I mentioned them specifically. My heart was pounding now. Whatever was sitting across the fire from me, it was not my best friend. But what had happened to the real Ethan? I tried to stay calm, tried not to let on that I knew something was wrong. I stood up and said I was going to get more firewood. The thing that looked like Ethan did not respond, just continued staring into the fire with those unblinking eyes. I walked to the edge of camp, my mind racing. Should I run? Should I confront it? Should I try to find Ethan? And then I heard it. A voice calling from the direction of the stream. My name, called out in Ethan's voice, desperate and scared. Carl, Carl, help me. I'm hurt. I turned and looked back at the fire. The thing was still sitting there, but its head had swiveled to face me, tracking my movement. It stood up slowly, its joints seeming to lock and unlock in sequence rather than moving fluidly the way a human body should. I made a decision. I ran toward the stream, toward the voice calling for help, crashing through the underbrush in the fading light. Behind me, I heard something following. Not footsteps exactly, but the sound of something large moving through the forest, breaking branches, disturbing leaves. I did not look back. I reached the stream and found Ethan lying on the ground near the water's edge, conscious but dazed, a large bruise forming on his forehead. He looked up at me with genuine fear and confusion in his eyes, and I knew immediately that this was the real Ethan. I grabbed his arm and pulled him to his feet, asking him what happened. He said he did not know. He had been filling the water bottles when something hit him from behind and everything went black. He woke up just a few minutes ago, disoriented and in pain, and started calling for me. That meant the thing had been at our camp, pretending to be Ethan, for at least 15 minutes before I noticed anything was wrong. I told Ethan we had to leave immediately, that something was wrong and we could not stay here. He was confused, asking what I was talking about. And that is when we both heard it. The sound of something moving through the forest behind us, getting closer. And then we saw it emerge from the tree line. It still looked like Ethan, same face, same clothes, but now it was not even trying to move like a human. It came toward us in a loping, unnatural gait, its arms and legs bending backward at the joints, its head tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck. Its mouth was open, and it was making a sound, a high-pitched whistling that hurt my ears and made my teeth ache. Ethan saw it and screamed. I do not think I have ever heard a sound like that come from him. Pure primal terror at seeing something wearing his own face moving toward us like a broken puppet. We ran. We left everything behind, our tents, our gear, our supplies, and we ran through the forest in the growing darkness. The thing chased us. I could hear it behind us crashing through the undergrowth, making that awful whistling sound. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, following the stream because it was the only landmark we could see in the dark. Eventually, we reached a wider trail, one of the main hiking paths, and we kept running. I do not know when the thing stopped following us. At some point, I realized I could not hear it anymore, but we did not stop running until we saw the lights of a ranger station in the distance. We stumbled up to the station, both of us bleeding from scratches and cuts. Ethan still dazed from whatever had hit him, and we told the ranger on duty that we needed help. The ranger could see we were genuinely terrified. He gave us water and first aid and asked what had happened. We told him everything, about the thing that had looked like Ethan, about how it chased us through the woods. The ranger listened without interrupting, and when we finished, he did not laugh or tell us we were crazy. Instead, he said we were not the first people to report something like that in this area. He told us about other hikers who had described encounters with things they called mimics or skinwalkers, entities that seemed able to copy the appearance of people, but never quite got the details right. He said the Cherokee people had stories about such things going back centuries, creatures that lived in the deep forest and sometimes took the form of humans to lure people away from safety. The ranger called for a search and rescue team to retrieve our gear and to look for any signs of what we had encountered. The team that went out the next morning found our campsite exactly as we had left it. Our tents were still standing, our fire was cold, and all our gear was there, but they also found something else. Trail cameras in the area, part of a wildlife monitoring project, had captured images from that night. The images showed our campsite, showed Ethan and me by the fire, and then showed something else, a figure that looked human from a distance but wrong in subtle ways, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. The cameras captured it, moving in ways that were biomechanically impossible, joints bending backward, limbs extending too far. And then the cameras showed it running, chasing something, moving at a speed no human could match. The footage was analyzed by wildlife experts who said it did not match any known animal, and the movements were inconsistent with any hoax they could imagine. The images are part of an ongoing study now, one of dozens of unexplained encounters documented in the Smokies. Ethan and I have not gone back to the Smoky Mountains since that trip. We still do our annual camping trip, but we stay much closer to civilization now, in campgrounds with other people around, never venturing into the deep backcountry. Ethan has no memory of what happened to him while he was unconscious, and he carries a scar on his forehead where he was struck. We do not talk about that night very often because when we do, we both end up reliving the terror of seeing something that should not exist wearing a familiar face. I know what I saw. I know that whatever was sitting across the fire from me that night was not my best friend. And I know that if I had not heard the real Ethan calling for help, I might have spent the entire night talking to that thing, never knowing the difference until it was too late. The mountains are beautiful, ancient, and full of mysteries, but some of those mysteries are dangerous, and some things in the wilderness are better left undiscovered. My name is Francis, and I am from Arlington, Virginia. I work as a freelance wildlife photographer, and about 2 years ago, I was on assignment in the remote backcountry of southwestern Virginia, trying to capture images of black bears in their natural habitat. I had been tracking a particular bear for 3 days, following its trail through dense forest, far from any established hiking paths. The area was incredibly isolated, the kind of wilderness where you could hike for days without seeing another person. I had all the proper permits, tracking equipment, and enough supplies for a week-long expedition. On the 4th day of my trek, everything went wrong. My GPS unit malfunctioned, the screen freezing and then going completely black. I tried my phone, but I had no signal, which was not unusual in that terrain. I still had my compass and paper maps, so I was not overly concerned at first. I figured I could navigate back to the nearest trail using traditional methods. I had been hiking for about 4 hours, trying to orient myself and find a landmark I recognized when I stumbled onto something that should not have been there. I pushed through a particularly dense thicket of mountain laurel and found myself standing at the edge of a large clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a compound, a collection of buildings that looked like they had been constructed over many years. There were 3 large barn-like structures, several smaller sheds, and what looked like barracks or dormitories. The entire compound was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, and there were people, dozens of them, moving between the buildings. Most were thin, almost emaciated, wearing dirty work clothes. They moved slowly, heads down, clearly exhausted. And watching them were armed men, 4 that I could see from my position carrying what looked like rifles or shotguns. I immediately dropped to the ground and crawled backward into the undergrowth, my heart pounding. This was not a legal operation. There are no authorized settlements or work camps in this area, and the armed guards, the fencing, and the condition of the workers all screamed that something very wrong was happening here. I needed to get away from this place and contact the authorities, but I also needed to know exactly where I was so I could lead them back to this location. I pulled out my paper map and my compass, taking careful note of my position relative to the mountain ridges I could see. I marked the location as precisely as I could, then started to slowly back away, moving as quietly as possible through the forest. I had made it maybe 30 yards when I heard shouting behind me. I had been spotted. I turned and saw 2 men with rifles running toward the fence, pointing in my direction. One of them was speaking into a radio. I did not wait to see what would happen next. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, abandoning any attempt at stealth, focused only on putting as much distance between myself and that compound as possible. Behind me, I could hear men shouting to each other, coordinating their search. I could hear them entering the forest, spreading out, trying to find me. I ran harder than I have ever run in my life, leaping over fallen logs, dodging between trees, ignoring the branches that whipped at my face and arms. My camera equipment, expensive gear that represented my livelihood, banged painfully against my side, but I did not dare drop it because the noise might give away my position. I found a massive fallen oak tree, its trunk creating a hollow space underneath, where the roots had torn free from the earth. I dove into that space and pressed myself flat against the ground, trying to control my breathing, trying to be absolutely silent. I could hear the men searching, their footsteps crunching through the dead leaves, their voices calling to each other. One of them passed within 10 feet of my hiding spot, close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke on his clothes. He stopped, and I held my breath, certain he had seen me. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then his radio crackled. A voice said something I could not make out, and the man near me responded that he had not found anything yet. He moved on, and I stayed frozen in my hiding spot, not daring to move. I must have stayed there for 2 hours, listening as the search continued around me. The men were methodical, covering the area in a grid pattern, but the forest was dense, and I had managed to get far enough from the compound that they were having trouble finding me. Eventually, the voices grew more distant, and then I heard them calling off the search. Someone on a radio said the boss would not be happy about a witness, and another voice said they would post extra patrols and keep an eye out. They were giving up the active search, but they would be watching for me. I waited another hour after the voices faded before I finally crawled out of my hiding spot. Every muscle in my body was cramped and aching, and I was covered in dirt and scratches. But I was alive, and I had not been caught. I pulled out my compass and started hiking in what I hoped was the direction of the nearest road. I moved as quickly as I dared, constantly checking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. I had marked my map with the location of the compound before I ran, using my compass bearings and the distinctive shape of the ridgeline to note the position. Now, I just needed to survive long enough to get that information to the authorities. As the sun began to set, I was still deep in the forest with no sign of civilization. I did not dare use my flashlight for fear of giving away my position, so I was forced to stop and spend the night huddled under a rock overhang, cold and terrified, listening to every sound in the darkness and wondering if the men from the compound were still hunting for me. The next morning, I started hiking again at first. Light. My water was running low, and I had not eaten since the morning before, but I pushed on. Around midday, I heard the most beautiful sound imaginable: traffic. I pushed through a final stretch of forest and emerged onto a 2-lane highway. I must have looked like something out of a horror movie, covered in dirt and scratches, my clothes torn, my hair wild, because the first car that saw me stopped immediately. An elderly couple asked if I needed help, and I told them I needed to get to the police immediately. They drove me to the nearest town, a small place called Cedar Bluff, and took me straight to the sheriff's office. I told the sheriff everything I had seen. I showed him my marked map, described the compound, the armed guards, the workers, who looked like prisoners. The sheriff listened carefully, taking notes, and then he made a phone call. Within hours, the sheriff's office was filled with state police and FBI agents. Apparently, they had been investigating reports of a human trafficking and forced labor operation in the region for over a year, but had never been able to locate it. My information, particularly the specific location I had marked on my map based on compass readings and terrain features, was exactly what they needed. They planned a raid for the following morning, and they asked me to stay in town under police protection in case the people running the compound came looking for me. That night, I stayed in a motel with a police officer stationed outside my door, and I barely slept, jumping at every sound, reliving the terror of being hunted through the forest. The next day, a multi-agency task force raided the compound. What they found was even worse than what I had witnessed. The operation was a massive illegal marijuana growing facility, but it was staffed by trafficked workers, people who had been brought to the United States under false pretenses and were being held against their will, forced to work without pay under threat of violence. Many of the workers had been there for years, living in horrific conditions, unable to escape because the compound was so isolated and so heavily guarded. The raid resulted in 23 people being rescued and 8 arrests, including the people running the operation. The FBI told me that if I had not found that compound and reported it, those people might have remained trapped there for years more. I had to testify in federal court, which was one of the most stressful experiences of my life. The people who had run the compound were convicted on multiple charges, including human trafficking, forced labor, weapons violations, and drug manufacturing. They received lengthy prison sentences. The workers who were rescued were provided with assistance, medical care, and help navigating the immigration system. Many of them had families back home who thought they were dead. The FBI agent in charge of the case told me that I was incredibly lucky. The people running that operation had killed before to protect their secret, and if they had caught me in the forest that day, I would not have survived. The case made national news for a few weeks, though I declined most interview requests because I just wanted to put the experience behind me. But I have not been able to put it completely behind me. I still do wildlife photography, but I no longer work alone in remote areas. I always bring a partner now, and I always make sure someone knows exactly where I am and when I am expected to return. I have anxiety attacks sometimes, triggered by being in dense forests or hearing men's voices shouting. I went through therapy to deal with the trauma of that experience, and it has helped, but I still have nightmares about being hunted through the woods, about being caught, about what would have happened if I had not found that hiding spot under the fallen oak. What I learned from this experience is that there are places in the Appalachian wilderness where terrible things happen, hidden away from civilization, where people are victimized and brutalized far from any help. And I learned that sometimes stumbling onto these places by accident can put your own life in terrible danger. I am grateful that I survived, and I am grateful that my ordeal led to the rescue of 23 people who were suffering in ways I can barely imagine. But I will never forget the feeling of being hunted, of knowing that if they caught me, I would simply disappear into those mountains and no one would ever know what happened to me. My name is Ruth, and I am from Baltimore, Maryland. I have been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for about 10 years now, and I consider myself a pretty experienced outdoors person. I know how to navigate, how to read trail markers, and how to stay safe in the wilderness. But 4 years ago, I encountered something on a remote section of trail in West Virginia that I still cannot explain, and that still haunts me when I think about it. I was doing a 3-day solo hike through a less traveled section of the trail, enjoying the solitude and the beautiful late summer weather. On the second day, I decided to take a detour off the main trail to explore a side path that looked interesting. The path was not well marked, but it was clear enough to follow, winding through old-growth forest with massive oak and hemlock trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. I'd been following this path for maybe 20 minutes when I came upon something that stopped me in my tracks. In the middle of the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and undergrowth, was a staircase. Not the remains of a staircase from some old building, but an intact, perfectly maintained stone staircase that rose about 20 feet into the air and then simply ended. It was beautiful, a strange way, made of what looked like granite or marble, with ornate carved details on the risers and handrails. The stairs were completely clean, no moss, no leaves, no dirt, as if someone had just swept them that morning. But there was nothing around it. No foundation, no other structures, no indication of what building these stairs might once have belonged to. They just stood there, in the middle of the wilderness, leading to nothing but empty air. I stood there, staring at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My first thought was that it must be a remnant of some old structure, maybe a grand house or a hotel that had burned down or been demolished years ago. But that did not explain why the stairs were in such perfect condition, or why there was no other debris or foundation stones around them. I pulled out my phone to take pictures and to check if I had cell service to look up any information about historic structures in this area. I had no signal, but I took several photographs from different angles. The staircase looked surreal in the photos, like something from a dream or a fantasy movie. This elegant structure just standing alone in the forest. I have always been a curious person, sometimes to a fault, and I decided to climb the staircase. I know that probably sounds foolish, but I wanted to see what it looked like from the top and maybe get a better view of the surrounding area that might give me some clue about what this thing was doing here. I started climbing, testing each step first to make sure the stone was solid and stable. The staircase seemed perfectly sound, showing no signs of age or deterioration. As I climbed higher, I started to feel strange. It is hard to describe, but I felt dizzy and disoriented, like the ground beneath me was tilting even though I could see the stairs were perfectly level. My ears started ringing, a high-pitched tone that grew louder with each step I took. By the time I reached the 10th step, about halfway up, I had to stop and steady myself against the handrail. I looked around, and the forest seemed wrong somehow. The trees looked different. They were arranged in patterns that my brain could not quite process, geometric formations that trees do not naturally grow in. The shadows were falling at angles that did not match the position of the sun. I could hear sounds, voices maybe, or music, but they seemed to be coming from a great distance and also from right next to me at the same time. I felt a pulling sensation, like something was trying to draw me forward, urging me to keep climbing, to reach the top and step off into the air. And part of me wanted to do it. Part of me felt an overwhelming compulsion to take that final step, to see what would happen if I walked off the edge of the staircase into nothing. It was not a suicidal impulse, nothing like that. It was more like a certainty that if I stepped off, I would not fall, that something else would happen, something important that I was meant to experience. That thought terrified me. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to have settled over my thoughts, and I started backing down the stairs. With each step down, the compulsion lessened, the ringing in my ears faded, and the world started to look normal again. By the time I reached the bottom, I was shaking, my heart pounding, and I felt like I had just narrowly avoided something terrible. I backed away from the staircase, not taking my eyes off it, half expecting it to do something, though I could not have said what. When I was about 30 feet away, I turned and ran back to the main trail, not stopping until I could no longer see the staircase through the trees. I pulled out my map and marked the location as precisely as I could, then continued on with my hike, eager to put distance between myself and that impossible structure. That night, at my campsite, I could not stop thinking about the staircase. I looked through the photos I had taken, and they were all there, clear images showing the structure from multiple angles. It was real. It existed. I had not imagined it. When I got home 2 days later, the first thing I did was search online for information about staircases in the forest. What I found was deeply unsettling. There are hundreds, maybe thousands, of reports from park rangers, hikers, and forest workers throughout North America, but particularly in the Appalachian region, describing freestanding staircases in the wilderness. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. The staircases are always in good condition, always seem out of place, and always create feelings of unease or compulsion in people who encounter them. Some park rangers have said they refuse to go near the staircases, and there are unofficial policies in some parks instructing rangers not to climb them under any circumstances. I found forums where people shared their experiences. Some reported climbing the staircases and experiencing missing time, finding that hours had passed when it felt like only minutes. Others described reaching the top and seeing things, landscapes that did not match the surrounding forest, skies that were the wrong color, or figures standing at the bottom of the stairs that disappeared when they climbed back down. Several people reported the same compulsion I felt, the overwhelming urge to step off into the air, and a few claimed they knew people who had done exactly that and were never seen again. The theories about these staircases range from the mundane to the bizarre. Some people believe they are genuine remnants of old structures, and that the strange feelings people report are just psychological reactions to encountering something unexpected in the wilderness. Others believe the staircases are markers of some kind, portals, or doorways to other places or dimensions left by something non-human. What really disturbed me was finding reports from park rangers saying that the staircases move. Multiple rangers reported finding staircases in their patrol areas, marking the locations on GPS, and then returning later to find the staircases gone, only to discover them weeks or months later in completely different locations. There are accounts of staircases appearing overnight in areas that had been thoroughly surveyed the day before. I decided I needed to report my sighting and provide the exact location, so I contacted the Forest Service for the area where I had been hiking. I spoke to a ranger and described what I had found. There was a long pause on the phone, and then the ranger asked me if I had climbed the stairs. When I said I had started to but stopped halfway, she sounded relieved. She told me that I had done the right thing by turning back, and that I should not return to that location or approach any similar structures I might encounter in the future. I asked her what the staircases were, and she said nobody knew. She confirmed that they had multiple reports of such structures in that forest, and that they had tried to study them, but equipment malfunctions frequently occurred near the staircases. Compasses spin, GPS units fail, cameras often produce distorted images, and people who spend too much time near them report nightmares and psychological disturbances. She said there had been discussions about removing the staircases, but every attempt to do so had failed. Tools would break, machinery would malfunction, and workers would refuse to continue after experiencing overwhelming feelings of dread. Eventually, the Park Service had decided to simply avoid them and advise others to do the same. The ranger asked me to send her my GPS coordinates and my photographs. I did, and a few days later she emailed me back. She said they had sent a team to investigate the location I had marked. The staircase was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there, no disturbance in the soil, no foundation stones, nothing. I have hiked many times since that encounter, but I have never seen another staircase in the forest, and I am grateful for that. I still have my photographs, proof that I did not imagine what I saw. Sometimes I look at those photos and wonder where that staircase is now, whether it is still in those woods somewhere, or whether it has appeared in some other forest, waiting for another curious hiker to find it and climb toward whatever waits at the top. I think about the compulsion I felt, the certainty that I should step off into the air, and I wonder what would have happened if I had not fought that urge. Would I have fallen 20 feet to the forest floor, or would something else have occurred? I do not know, and I'm not sure I want to know. What I do know is that there are things in these mountains that exist outside our understanding of how the world works. Structures that appear and disappear, that create impossible feelings and impossible experiences, that seem to operate according to rules that are not the rules of our reality. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient, and they hold secrets that we may never fully understand. I encountered one of those secrets on a summer afternoon, and it changed the way I think about the wilderness. Now, when I hike, I stay on marked trails, and if I ever see another staircase standing alone in the forest, I will walk away without looking back. My name is Carol, and I am from Charlotte, North Carolina. 5 years ago, I inherited a property from my grandmother, a woman I had never met. My grandmother had died when I was very young, before I was old enough to remember her, and my mother rarely spoke about her. From what little I knew, she had been estranged from the family for decades, living alone in a cabin somewhere on the Tennessee-North Carolina border. When the estate lawyer contacted me to inform me that I had inherited the property, I was surprised to learn it even existed. The lawyer explained that the cabin sat on 15 acres of forested land, and that according to my grandmother's will, it was to pass to me with one specific condition. I was never to sell the land. It had to remain in the family. At the time, I thought this was just an eccentric request, the kind of thing an old woman might insist on out of sentimentality. I decided to drive out to see the property, thinking I might be able to fix it up and use it as a vacation rental or a weekend getaway. The drive took me about 3 hours from Charlotte, following increasingly narrow roads until I turned onto a gravel driveway that wound through dense forest for nearly a mile before reaching the cabin. The cabin itself was larger than I had expected, a 2-story log structure with a stone chimney and a wide front porch. It looked old but structurally sound, though clearly no one had lived there in months. The lawyer had given me the keys and explained that a local property management company had been maintaining the place, mowing the lawn and keeping the pipes from freezing, but that they had recently stopped because the workers refused to go there anymore. When I asked why, the lawyer had been vague, saying something about the place making people uncomfortable. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The cabin was furnished with antique furniture, all of it neat and well preserved, as if my grandmother had just stepped out for a walk and would be back any moment. There were photographs on the walls, old black and white images of people I did not recognize, and shelves filled with books about Appalachian history, folk magic, and herbalism. The kitchen was old-fashioned but clean, and when I opened the pantry, I found it stocked with canned goods and dry foods, all of it relatively fresh. That struck me as odd because my grandmother had been dead for 6 months, and I knew the property management company was only supposed to handle exterior maintenance. Who had been buying groceries and stocking the pantry? I walked through the house, taking inventory of what would need to be repaired or updated. The upstairs had 3 bedrooms, all furnished, all clean, all giving the impression that someone was actively living there. In the master bedroom, I found a rocking chair positioned by the window overlooking the forest. There was a knitting project sitting on the chair, needles still stuck through the yarn, as if someone had been working on it recently. I touched the yarn and found it was not dusty. That made no sense. I went back downstairs and checked the kitchen more carefully. The dishes in the drain rack were dry but clean, and when I opened the refrigerator, I found fresh eggs, butter, and milk. The milk had an expiration date 3 days in the future. Someone had been here. Someone was still coming here. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I pulled out my phone to call the lawyer, but I had no cell signal. I decided I needed to leave and come back another day with someone else, maybe the police, to figure out who was trespassing on the property. As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor directly above my head, walking from one end of the house to the other. I froze, my heart pounding. I called out, asking if someone was there, but there was no answer, just the continued sound of footsteps. I should have run. Every instinct was telling me to get out of that house immediately, but I was also angry. This was my property, and someone was in my house without permission. I grabbed a poker from the fireplace and slowly climbed the stairs. The footsteps had stopped. I checked each bedroom, looking in closets and under beds, but there was no one there. The rocking chair in the master bedroom was moving, swaying back and forth gently, as if someone had just stood up from it. But there was no one in the room, no one visible anyway. I heard a sound from downstairs, the sound of pots and pans clanking in the kitchen, the sound of someone cooking. I went back downstairs, poker still gripped in my hand, and found the kitchen exactly as I had left it. Nothing had been moved, nothing was cooking, but the smell of food hung in the air, something savory, like stew or roast meat. I heard a chair scrape against the floor in the dining room, and when I looked, one of the chairs had been pulled out from the table, and there was a place setting, a plate, silverware, and a glass of water, arranged neatly as if someone was about to sit down for a meal. I had not done that. The place setting had not been there 5 minutes ago when I walked through that room. I backed toward the front door, not taking my eyes off the dining room, and that is when I saw her. Standing in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room was a woman. She looked to be in her 70s, with long gray hair and wearing a simple dress that might have been fashionable in the 1970s. She was looking directly at me, and her face was the same face I had seen in some of the old photographs on the wall. My grandmother. She did not look transparent or ghostly. She looked solid, real, as if she was alive and standing there. But I knew she was dead. I had seen the death certificate. She smiled at me, but it was not a warm smile. It was cold, possessive, and somehow threatening. When she spoke, her voice sounded wrong, like multiple voices speaking in unison, distorted and echoing in a way that made my ears hurt. She said that this land had belonged to our family for 5 generations, that it was sacred, that it was bound to us by blood and by promises made long ago. She said I must never sell it, never let it pass out of family hands, because if I did, terrible things would happen. I asked her what she meant, what would happen, but she just continued speaking as if she had not heard me. She said she had made a vow when she was young, a promise to the land and to the things that lived in the land, and that vow had tied her spirit to this place. She said she would never leave, that she would always protect what was hers, and that I was part of that now, whether I wanted to be or not. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath misting in the air. Frost began forming on the windows, and the water in the glass on the table froze solid. My grandmother's face changed, her expression twisting into something angry and inhuman. She told me to get out, that I was not ready, that I was not worthy, but that the land would wait for me, and when I died, my spirit would return here just as hers had. And then she was gone. She did not fade or disappear gradually. One moment she was there, and the next the room was empty. I did not wait around to see if she would come back. I ran out of that house, jumped in my car, and drove away so fast that I nearly wrecked on the winding driveway. I drove straight to the lawyer's office and demanded to know what my grandmother had been involved in, what was going on with that property. The lawyer was reluctant to discuss it, but when I described what I had experienced, he sighed and told me that my grandmother had been known in the area as someone who practiced what locals called the old ways, a mix of Cherokee spirituality and Appalachian folk magic. He said she had been obsessed with keeping the land in the family, and that, according to local legend, she had made some kind of bargain or pact to ensure that would happen. He said several people over the years had reported seeing her at the cabin even after she died, and that was why the property management company had stopped sending workers there. I tried to sell the property. I listed it with a real estate agent and had 3 different potential buyers come to view it. Every single one of them backed out. The first one said she heard voices telling her to leave. The second one saw my grandmother standing on the porch, and when he tried to approach her, she vanished. The third one made it as far as the front door before running back to his car, refusing to explain what he had seen, but saying he would not set foot on that property again for any price. After the third failed showing, the real estate agent dropped me as a client, saying the property was unsellable and she did not want to be involved with it anymore. I contacted paranormal investigators, priests, anyone I could think of who might be able to help. A few came to the property, but none of them were able to do anything. They said the presence there was too strong, too deeply rooted, and that it would take more than a simple blessing or cleansing to remove it. I still own the property. I pay property taxes on it every year, and I hire a different company to handle minimal maintenance, though I have to pay them extra because workers are reluctant to go there. I have never set foot on the property again since that day 5 years ago. Sometimes I think about what my grandmother said, about how when I die, my spirit will return there. I do not know if that is true, but I do know that something unnatural is bound to that land, and my family is bound to it as well. Local historians I have spoken to say that land has been in my family since the early 1800s, and there are stories going back generations about the women in my family who live there. Stories about strange lights in the woods, about people who went onto the property and never came back, about deals made with things that were not human. I do not know what my ancestors did or what promises they made, but the consequences of those actions have echoed down through the generations, and now I am stuck with a piece of property I cannot sell and do not dare visit. My grandmother vowed never to leave her land, and she kept that vow. Even death could not make her abandon it. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the same fate awaits me.